Hi, everyone. It's Amy Fothergill, and today we're going to be talking about all the basics of gluten-free flour. And I'm going to be showing you some of the flours I use, how to make your own flour, and some things that I actually made today. But before we get started, I want to introduce Andrea Tucker, who started Gluten-Free College 101, and just give her a minute to tell you about herself and the group that she has created in the community. Andrea? I can't hear you yet. Oh, do I have to unmute you? Hold on.
I'm here.
Here-
Hi,
I got
everybody.
you.
Yeah, I don't want to take up precious time because I know we're all excited about getting to the heart of this class. But if we haven't met yet, I'm happy to meet you. My name is Andrea Tucker. I'm the founder of Gluten-Free College 101, our great community, which brings us all together and, of course, brings wonderful, talented people like Amy into our lives. Um, Amy, I'll let you take over because we're all excited to hear what you can share in your expertise.
Okay. All right. So we can go into the play mode with the slides now. So my husband, Alan, is helping me. He's about 4 feet away, and he's going to be helping me. So if you have any questions, he's the one who's going to be telling me when there's questions. All right. So we can go to the next slide. I'm going to tell you about the agenda. Just press enter. Okay, so I'm going to do a very, very quick my story. Then we're going to talk about the basics of gluten-free flours and binders. I'm going to show you my what I call do-it-yourself flour blend, the one I used for many years, some of the other flours that are available and how to use them in cooking and baking. We're going to review some of the more popular ones. I have some of them behind me here, and then I'm going to share with you the one I use in my bakery. And we're going to go over a couple of recipes and then wrap it up. And then interspersed, we'll do some, I have one quiz and a couple of polls. So next. All right. So a little bit about me. I went to a culinary school. I went to the Cornell Hotel School. And I was really interested in culinary. I worked in restaurants, I worked in catering, contract food service. I loved cooking. And while I was in contract food service, so that's the companies that run the food service like colleges and hospitals and such. I went into the regular office and went through a accounting software implementation, which was like, whoa, this is so interesting. So I switched from food to software. Everyone says, how did you make that jump? And I started to teach and I started to write curriculum and then I became a salesperson. So it was a really interesting to learn a different process that didn't have to do with food. But at home, I was always cooking. And then I met my lovely husband, and we had 2 kids, and everything was going great. And then all of a sudden, and everything was going great. And I was figuring out like, what am I going to do? So I started what I called the family chef, and that business was teaching people. I was like, oh, I'm going to take my food and the cooking. I'm going to become a cooking instructor. I'm going to teach people how to cook because all these mothers are like, how do you make this and how do you make that? And then we realized my daughter had to be gluten free. That was in 2007, and I don't know how long everyone's been gluten free, but that was when there was almost nothing. And I would try things, and I would say, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. How could I feed this to my child?" So I used my culinary background to figure out how to make food taste good. So I did cooking classes, consultations, lots of things. I wrote a cookbook called The Warm Kitchen, and then about maybe 4 years ago, right before the pandemic, I started a home-based bakery called Artisanal Delights by Amy. And I always say it's always delicious and always gluten-free is my byline. And that's when I started really getting good. And I'm going to explain how I got good because it's actually really easy. All right, next. So I have a quiz before we get started. Do you think that is there a gluten-free flour on the market that is truly one-to-one that you can use this one single flour for any recipe? So we're going to start the quiz in just 1 second and just put your response either true or false. And we'll give it about a minute. Now I'm curious to see what people think. Because if you look at the packages, many of the packages say one-to-one substitute, use for any recipe. So what do you think? All right, we'll wait another. Did we get everybody? Can you tell if we got everybody? Okay. So there's things like Better Batter, there's Bob's, there's Cup for Cup, there's Vitacost, Trader Joe's has one, Bob's has a couple different flours. There's so many more small, small ones. All right, I think we can stop. I think everybody gets the message, right? And the answer, in my opinion, is false. I've been doing this a long time, and what that means is I can have not found one flour that does it all, because some flours are good for cakes, and some flours are good for pizza, some flours are good maybe for muffins and cookies, but it's really hard to replicate regular flour and gluten free. And again, this is my opinion. I just haven't found something that does it all without adding something to it. All right, so let's go back to the presentation. And you can see the results over there. And we're going to talk about gluten-free basics next. So just go to play at the top there, Al. Yep. And next slide. All right. So what I found works, and this is important because if you say to me, I can't have potato or I can't have tapioca, it's a ratio. It's a basic ratio of 2 parts grain to 1 part starch. So its grains are rice, millet, quinoa, and starches are things like potato starch, tapioca starch, cornstarch, etc. You always want to make sure every flour that you're using, if you are making your own flour blend, that it is gluten-free, because you might find the tapioca starch isn't made in a dedicated facility, for example. So there's some example of the common grains, sorghum, quinoa, buckwheat, which I always thought was kind of funny. I'm like, how come wheat isn't the title of a gluten-free flour, but it is by itself? Teff and garbanzo. Garbanzo is technically a legume, but I kind of put it in the grain category because it acts more like a grain in that context. And common starches, tapioca, if you say tapioca starch, they're pretty much the same. Potato starch, of course, corn starch. And sometimes you might see potato flour, and it really is different to the starch. So you want to be careful, unless the recipe for a particular flour blend calls for that, you probably don't want to use it. Sometimes there's a small amount of potato flour in a blend recipe, but it can't be used one for one. And the most common combination is a combination of rice, potato starch, and tapioca starch. So that's really what most of them have. Sometimes they'll have sorghum and a few other things. But the other thing they usually always have is a binder. We're going to talk about binders next. One of the things that I found makes a huge difference for baking is having an electric scale. So in the chat, I think we put a link to, I have an Amazon, if you want to call it, store where I make recommendations. So I'm an affiliate, means I get a really small percentage if you buy anything that I suggest. And this scale, I think, maybe costs about $10, maybe 12, and it is for baking, even for cooking, life-changing. So I can do any proportions. It's so much more accurate. I really think you should have that. The other thing that if you're going to start doing any kind of yeast baking is making sure you have a thermometer. So this is an electric thermometer, and you would just put it into the water, and then it will tell you when your water or milk or whatever is at the right temperature. So those are 2 important things. You can buy most of these flours on Amazon. You can buy them on vitacost.com. We're going to talk about authentic foods. So sometimes at the particular vendor itself, and a lot of them in the supermarket. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the basics of binders for baking. So if you were to make a flour blend, and this is my flour blend that I make, I keep it in a little tin. If I just use this for baking, there's no gluten, so there's nothing really to hold it together. And you almost always have to have a binder. So you could use something like xanthan gum or guar gum or psyllium husk. And what's important is the ratio. So if you're doing most recipes for cookies and muffins, pancakes, things like that, for every 2 cups of flour, you want to use a half a teaspoon of the xanthan gum. That is if either the flour blend that you buy doesn't have gum or you're making your own. Guar gum is a little bit different, and psyllium husk, it varies. You just really have to look at the recipe. And psyllium husk is really good for bread, is what I found. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so my simple do-it-yourself gluten-free flour blend that I was using up until I discovered the one I used for my bakery is, again, you see the 2-to-1 ratio. So if you do this in cups, you can do half of this, double this, quadruple this. It depends on how big your container is. It would be 4 cups of a super fine rice flour. Now, why do you think I would say super? Why do you think? What's the difference? And I'm just sort of saying this generically. I don't really necessarily have to answer. Using a superfine rice flour, and the reason is with the superfine flours, they're not as gritty. So then that means that your baked good hopefully will be less gritty. So if you can't find, like this is one, this is a just a regular white rice flour from Bob's. It's not super fine, but it is good when I make pizza because it has a little bit of grit. So super fine is usually better. I usually do half brown, half white, and then if I'm feeling really fancy, instead of this 2 cups of the white, which I have my white here, I'll use 1 cup of white and I have a sweet rice flour, and that is a little bit stickier and just works a little bit better. And then if you're again using 2 and 2, so that makes 4 cups total, and I just mix it right in here. Then you're going to add 1 cup of potato starch and 1 cup of tapioca. And what I found in general is that if you could weigh out a cup and then you could just do it with weights. But if I'm doing it fast and it's close enough, it's all right. But when I go to actually measure out flour for a recipe, and if I'm not using a scale, you really want to be careful not to pack it down because you can make that more dry. So usually I'll scoop about half and then I'll maybe scoop it with the cup and then I scoop it with a tablespoon and I flatten it out. And if you don't have a scale, that's the best way to do it. But you don't want to pack it in because it means you're putting in too much more flour than probably the recipe needs. Okay, next slide. So this blend that I make myself, that I was using honestly up until I guess 5 years ago, about 5 years ago, I used it for pancakes, waffles, quick breads, really easy. Just that 2 cups of whatever, if it's 2 cups flour, half a teaspoon of gum. Cookies and cakes, sometimes I would need a little more gum. Pie crust worked really well for. I could use it for pasta, but for the pasta recipe, I usually ended up adding a little more tapioca flour. That's fresh pasta. And I also use it, this is why it's like really close by. I use it for making a roux, and we're going to talk about that later, or flouring meat, or you could also just use the superfine rice flour. I also have on hand in my little pantry here is what I call bench flour. So I take this superfine rice flour, and I put it in a container here. And then when I need to flour something, I need to flour the counter, I have to just put a little bit, I just pour it from here. So it's just a little nice tip to make things easier. So what I found with this particular blend that I made, it's just not as good for pizza, but doable, right? I mean, I could use it. I have used it for pizza. It has to have more gum, and it might need some other flour. It's usually sorghum if I'm trying to replicate bread. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's talk about some of the other flours that are out there besides the rice, potato, and tapioca. So sorghum, it's again, make sure that these are all gluten-free. It's slightly darker. It is great for bread. It's heavier and denser, and it does well with even making bagels. You just some of the blends out there. I'll show you an example. This is the Trader Joe's. They have sorghum. Oh no, this one, yeah, has millet, potato starch, tapioca, rice flour, and sorghum. I find it to be a little heavy, so it's just not always going to work for something lighter if you're making, maybe a cupcake or maybe a muffin's okay. That's why you have to be careful what flour you're using for what purpose. Next is millet. When I first wrote my cookbook, I didn't know as much. Honestly, it's over 11 years ago. And I had millet in the mix because I thought I needed it, but I found that it also made it a little too dense. It does add like a nutty flavor, even though it's not a nut, it's a grain. And it could make things dry and it would give it a yellow color. So it's not terrible, but just depends on what you're making. Quinoa is another flour. It's a little bit lighter. Quinoa is technically a seed, but we call it a grain. It's a little darker than the rice flours and really good in multigrain breads. And a lot of times you see it made used for pasta. Buckwheat, very similar. It can also be used by itself to make crepes. That's what they do in France. And teff flour, very also. I use. Where's the buckwheat? Buckwheat and teff almost interchangeably. If I want to make a regular bread a little bit more like a multigrain, I'll add some of these. So either buckwheat or teff. And teff is also used to make a spongy Ethiopian bread, in case you're wondering. I'm tip of my tongue about the name of this. It's like I think it's like an Energer or something. You can look it up. And lastly, garbanzo flour. Now, back in the old days, Bob's used to, they had an all-purpose gluten-free flour, and they used to use garbanzo bean flour in that, and I did not like it at all. It gave the batter a really funny taste, and sometimes gave the product a funny taste as well. So I was like, I stopped using it. But it's good with certain things. I found if I make cornbread, it doesn't it doesn't seem to take on the flavors of the garbanzo bean. It kind of holds it together well, and also falafels. And you just want to be careful with any falafel mix or any falafel that you get from a restaurant or a grocery store because although traditionally it's made with garbanzo flour, many restaurants and many mixes use wheat flour, so it's no longer gluten free. But the old fashioned way is to make it gluten free. Okay, next slide, please. All right, some of the commercial GF flours. I talked a little bit about authentic foods, and spoiler alert, this is my favorite one. This is what I use for the bakery. So they make a number of regular flours, and then they have three major blends. So there's the bread flour. They make what's called, so Authentic Foods is the company, and then the product is Steve's. He's the founder. Pizza crust mix, and then they have a cake mix. And initially, I was very hesitant to use this because I had to weigh everything out and I had never used a scale. But once I started using it and using the scale, it completely changed my bake product. So that's I'll tell you, I'm going to talk more about that. All right, Bob's is, it's pretty good, but I tried to make bread with it and it did not work. I tried to make certain maybe like some of the cookies, it's just not quite there. So the issue is if you have a recipe and it's a regular recipe and you're trying to convert it, you have to sort of play around with for each of these flour blends. Is it really 2 cups? Is it maybe a little bit less than 2 cups or a little bit more than 2 cups? That's another part of this gluten-free flour puzzle. The another one's King Arthur's, and they have a number of products. Theirs are pretty good, but again, I can't use it for everything. Better Batter, I've it's expensive, as is the Steve, so I'm going to talk about that. But it's pretty good, but it's just like I can't. Sometimes I've tried it with recipes that I use for the Steves, and it just didn't work quite as well. What else? How are we doing on the chat? I'll just want to make sure there's no questions there. Okay, okay. And then Vitacost is a company. So if you haven't used them yet, it's called vitacost.com. And they make gluten-free flours. They make blends. This one doesn't have gum, or you can buy one with gum, but I like having this on hand in case I need it. And a cup for cup is another one that is pretty expensive. And they just recently, finally, I think, changed the formula so that it didn't have milk powder because I personally, so besides my daughter, the four of us, I have a son as well, and my husband, we all eat gluten-free. So it's not just for her. They add milk powder to it. So I didn't really want to use it because I prefer to be dairy-free. And another one that you might see out there is, it's not listed there, but Otto's is a cassava flour. And, it might say, oh, it's a 1-to-1 substitution. It says here, simple swap, 1 to 1. It's not exactly. So for most of these, I'd say it really is better if you have a recipe that goes with that flour or create your own recipe because it's not 100% is what I found. So there are also probably 50 more flours, and I'm probably not even, it's probably more like 100 different flours on the market that might be from a different bakery. They might be, I know Namaste makes one, and is it Arrowhead or Arrowwood? There's an Arrow something. They make flour, and these are the ones that are more popular. So that's my recommendation is either use the recipe maybe that's on the particular bag or one recipe. If you use this particular flour, find a recipe that works with this flour before you, or you may have to play with it a little bit. You may have to do some experimenting. And what the other thing you want to do is when you look at the label, you want to look to see if there's added gum. So for example, if I look at these two, where's my Trader Joe's? Right, I'm looking at these two as potential flours to use. The Trader Joe's flour that I'm holding in my hand has gum, and this particular mix here does not have gum. So if I were to use this one, I would have to know how much gum to use. If I were to use this one, if I was making, again, a basic recipe, I wouldn't add any at all. Okay, next. So, what do you need? So, if you are looking for, oh, Amy, thanks so much. I love the scale. I might want to get this, handy dandy container or, that thermometer. What do you like to use? That is uh, on Amazon, and you can look at those. Yes, there's a question now. She's good. Oh, and GF Jules is another good one. I don't, I just, because I think I think in the old days you had to order it. I haven't used it that much, but I know her personally. She's great. And I know a lot of her flowers work really, really well. That's a good one. I guess I was thinking of things you see in the store, and I don't see that one in the store. I live in California. Everyone's from all over. Any other questions? Okay. So if you do want, that's a link there, and it should be in the chat. If not, maybe we can always throw it to the chat now when we're done. It'll be in the presentation notes, and you could just see what I like to use. All right, and next. So I want to show you next. A couple of people already saw this. I have a home-based bakery. What that means is I'm licensed in my local county to bake out of my home, only things that are non-perishable. But here's what I made today for my customers. I'm going to start with the one I like the most. These are apple fritters. And I found a recipe online and I substituted the recipe for regular recipe with not the pizza, with the bread flour. So a lot of the fried donuts, you want to use bread flour. It works really well. For another thing I made, these are little flatbreads because I just got tired of never having naan and never having little, like be able to make little pizzas. And that is this one, the pizza crust mix. And then the other one that people love, I'm going to be delivering when we're done with this class, is bread. You can see that. So those are the breads. And I make all these with the Steve's product. This is not, I actually didn't want to tell anyone about this for the longest time because I was like, this is my little secret. Oh my gosh, this is why my stuff is so good. And then I finally got to the point where I'm like, I want more gluten-free goodness in the world. So I want to share what I've learned with other people. So the cake flour, there's a recipe on the back, and that's the recipe I use for my bakery. And I make wedding cakes and birthday cakes and all sorts of cakes. And this is what I use. And the thing about the Steves is that very honestly, it's expensive, but worth it. They don't use gum. They use a cellulose fiber, like similar to psyllium husk. And it's very particular. So as I've said, if I were to take this flour and then try to substitute a recipe, I'm going to have to try it a couple times because I may need a little bit less, I may need a little bit more. But once you get the right proportion, it is amazing. And they usually say use a little bit less. So if you have, say, 2 cups, they use about a tablespoon or so less. That's because it just can get very thick. For the bread flour, I make, like I said, donuts. I make bread, brioche. I make bagels with this. I mean, it's just, I've never seen anything like it. When I make the dough, I can actually roll the dough without it sticking to my hands and shape it. And that's a huge difference in the other gluten-free flours that I've used. And then the pizza flour mix makes pizza. I make flatbread. I make garlic knots, calzones, and same thing. You can roll it out just like you would a regular, in the old days, like 20 years ago, I feel like when I used regular flour. So that's my little plug for Steve's. If I were to, if I'm going to do some more classes, I will probably. Well, not for all the classes, but I've taught. Here's a data point. I had one of my customers. I did a bunch of online classes last year. I did a whole series on brioche dough, and I had a customer who said to me, "I've only made cakes and cookies. I don't know how to bake." And I said, take the class, get the flour, and let's see what happens. And she would say, and she wouldn't even watch the class, she'd watch the recording. But I had the recipe and the recording together. And she would send me pictures of her brioche and her donuts and her cinnamon rolls. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's how good it is. Like it's not like you need a culinary degree. If you just need to be able to use a scale, use a thermometer, and follow a recipe. I was so excited. Okay, next think this is the yes. All right. So I work with them in the sense I don't get anything from this. I just do it so that he knows that I sent you to them. If you go to their website to purchase the flour, they'll give you a discount code on the shipping. Yes, you can buy this on, I think, Vitacost and Amazon. But like anyone, they're a relatively small business. And I think it's best to always buy direct so that they stay in business. I think that of every flour I've ever tried, it's the best one. And it was sort of what the story is. I had some, and then it was COVID, and I was like, oh, I was kind of bored. And I was like, let me start using this, and let me start using the scale. And once I started playing with the recipes and the ingredients, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then I started selling it, and the people would come to me and say, oh my gosh, your stuff is amazing. And when I was during COVID, I worked at a farmer's market, and I didn't have my booth didn't say gluten free. It just had a little sign that said ask about gluten free options. And I would have people come every week and they're like, your scones or this. And most of them didn't even know it was gluten free. So that's um, I feel like that sort of told me what I needed to know about it. All right. I think we're going to move on. And I think we're doing, I'm talking really fast. Any questions? Let me take a little breath. Let me see. I'm going to check to see if there are any questions. Now's a good time. I'm going to take a sip of water. Was that a no? No questions? Okay, excellent. I hope I feel like there was so much content that I was worried it was going to take me an hour and 50 minutes. So I wanted to keep things moving. Okay, so part of my strategy or thought process with doing this class for this group was to enable college kids or families of college kids to be able to make anything because so I have 2 kids. They're 20 and 18. They're both in college now. Both of them are sending me pictures of what they're making, and so I'm super proud because they're able to cook for themselves. And I guess they learned something along the way. And I'd like to be able to help students or the families of students with cooking and baking. And I just want to give you some of my philosophies, and I think that this could help. And then it could potentially help me to figure out what specifically people want to learn because I feel like I don't teach recipes. I really rely on technique. It's really important to understand what it is you're doing, not just putting ingredients together and serving it. Like, what are you doing when you're making it? Like, what's happening in the actual recipe? So, when we're talking about cooking and baking, what's really important for both of those is flavor and what it tastes like, the ingredients, what it tastes like after, and really using all those senses. The texture is important. So, especially when we're talking about baked goods, but even when we're talking about cooking, because we don't want it too thick and we don't want it too thin, we don't want it gritty. Proportions are very important. So if when I cook, I often don't use a recipe. I'll just look at it and say, oh, that's about the right same amount of onion to the same amount of celery to the same amount of carrots. Sometimes I have to stop and say that's a half an onion is about two stalks of celery or two carrots so that it seems right in the recipe itself. Um, Cooking and baking, and I don't know if there are any kids online or young adults. I don't want to scare you, but it is a combination of chemistry, physics, and algebra, which some of you might be like, I didn't like those subjects in school. So chemistry is all the reactions. So when you take acid and you combine it with baking soda, baking powder, heat, what happens with an egg when, all the different interactions, salt, etc. And the physics are, heat transfer. When my husband and I today was helping me make he was helping me make the apple fritters, which were fried. And I was like, you have to move the donuts around because the hot oil has to transfer heat to the middle. And I mean, he's like super techie smart guy, but it just sort of reminded me of how physics come into play all the time when you're, cooking and baking. And algebra for sure, because if you when I tripled that recipe, one of the things I didn't do was I didn't write it down. I almost added too much milk. So you got to be able to know your proportions and know how to do halves and quarters and so forth. All right, so more specifically with cooking. So let's think about when we're cooking. Like I said, I'm not good at using recipes, but I have learned to write them. Seasoning, and especially seasoning with something as simple as salt or using herbs, spices, etc. If you taste something and it tastes flat, often it probably doesn't have enough salt. And you could have the best ingredients in the world, but if you don't have the right combination of seasoning, it could not taste good. The flavors. So again, what goes well together? What if basil goes really nicely with cilantro if you're making Mexican cooking, and then basil also goes really well with garlic and olive oil to make pesto, things like that. You do as much as you can. If you use quality ingredients, it will show through when when you make whatever you're making. For example, I'm very particular about the butter and the sugar and the eggs that I use because people always say everything you make, it tastes good. And it's not just the recipe, it's because the ingredients I'm using are good. Um, for cooking, you really have to understand things like, what are the techniques that are used? What is the difference between sauteing and braising? What's the difference between water or a sauce simmering versus boiling? And what's the difference between, say, roasting, grilling, all those things? So that's what I'm hoping I could teach some of you, because I think that that will help then to make anything that your heart desires. When it comes to baking, baking is really about precision. And as I've said, I mean, I wrote my cookbook, and if you look at my cookbook, everything's in cups and teaspoons, and that's just not how I cook anymore. I am so anal when I cook. If it's 205 grams, I use 205 grams. I'm very, very specific. The temperature is really important in baking. So you can't start, well, I shouldn't say you can. You shouldn't start with, if you have cold eggs and cold milk and cold butter, it can affect the baking time. It can affect how your product comes out. So temperature specifically in baking is really, really important. Ratios. So, if I'm making a muffin and I use a half a cup of blueberries, that's probably okay. But if I use 2 cups, it would be too much. Or if I use a quarter cup, it's not enough. So knowing sort of that right ratio of whatever you're making to make sure that it tastes good and the texture is right and things like that. Consistency with baking is very important, and knowing what the consistency should be like. So your pancake, it's usually very thin. You can ladle it, but a cake batter. What's interesting is when you make, say, when I've made a vanilla cake, that is almost like a thicker batter. But when I make a chocolate cake, so using usually hot liquid, it's thin, so it pours. So, and that's okay. But no, it's important that you know that, because if you might say, "Oh, something's wrong with my chocolate cake batter," it's runny. It's supposed to look like that. So, those are good things to know about. And then always, and for both of these, is the flavor. So, what, how much sugar is there, what kind of extract did you use? Did you use any other seasonings in there? Sometimes I'll put coffee in my chocolate cakes to bring out the chocolate flavor. Not a lot, and I always use decaf. I like to use cardamom and rose water, and then it just makes things really interesting. Okay, I think that's everything about basic cooking and baking. Okay, next. All right, so we're going to do a little poll, and what I'd like to find out from you is what are you most interested in learning? So I think it's three different questions, and I want to find out, do you want to learn about cooking first, baking first, and then what do you consider yourself as far as those? So if you could take a second to read through those questions, I'm going to come over here. I'm going to read all right. So what kind of cook would you consider yourself? What kind of baker would you consider yourself? And what are you most interested in learning about? And it could be you or someone in your family. And like I said, if I could sing, I would do some little music or something, but maybe I'll take a sip of water. Any questions, honey? You guys are a quiet audience. I think I've shown you everything. Okay. So there's three different questions, and each question has a number of responses. And just let me know. I'm just curious what it is, because I really, the whole reason this started, for those of you who are part of the Gluten-Free College 101 group, was that there was a mom who said, I'm so disappointed. My daughter wants to learn culinary and she can't do it because they don't have any gluten-free options, and it won't really be safe for her and she can't learn. And then there was another mom that said pretty much the same thing. And I just felt really bad. And I said, I kind of want to help and see what I can do. And I've been doing this so long time. So I have sort of my mom noticed this in me, like an instinct for how things work together. But when I stop and I'm doing something, I'm like, oh, like when I was making the donuts this morning, and I'm like, what's happening with that donut? Oh, that hot oil is cooking. But if it's the surface isn't getting part of the oil, it's, we have to make sure we're rotating it so that it's happens at the same time. Maybe give it. We're almost actually. We did pretty well. I'm just gonna after this we're gonna be going through the recipes, and I'm going to give you some things to think about. What do we think? Okay. Do you want to give me the results because I can't see it from here, and I can just say it, or does it say it on the screen? Yeah. Can you read? Can you read from what that says there?
So what kind of cook would you consider yourself? 17% say basic.
Okay, so we have 17% say basic.
57% say medium.
Most people are medium, and a couple advanced. Okay.
What kind of baker would you consider yourself to be? 40% say basic.
Okay, that's all right.
40% say medium.
All right.
And 20% say I prefer to cook.
Okay. So it sounds like most people, the people that you want to bake are probably beginners, which is good. That's good because I have a lot of knowledge.
I'm most interested in learning about cooking basics, 20%, baking basics, 20%, and advanced baking, 60%.
Okay, so a lot of people want to learn about advanced baking, which I think the reason probably is these are the things you really can't get everywhere. And I think if you can make it yourself, you're going to save money, and it's going to always be better when it's fresh. If you make something and have it right away, as opposed to when you go to a store, you don't know exactly when it was made. And it does, unfortunately, with gluten-free, the quality tends to be lost the further you get away from when it was first made, with a couple of exceptions. But restaurants are better, but they're still, you can't always get everything that I'm really bad. I get these little cravings. I'm like, I feel like having something like lasagna or I don't know, uh, whatever it is I'm in the mood for. And then that's what I end up making. What did we have there? A couple of weeks ago, I was like, I was in the mood for chicken cutlets because my mom always made chicken cutlets, and I made my husband. I was like, you have to help me with the breading. Come on, let's do this. But when it was all done, it was excellent. Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow. Yes. Oh, sure. Question.
I love experience. tried some bread frying using it. They were delicious. I tried to learn how to use it.
Okay, so the question is about psyllium husk and saying that they've tried some breads with psyllium husk and they want to learn how to use it. One thing I can tell you is that you want to make sure within a recipe, you want to make sure that you know if it's powder or whole, because if the powder is ground up and is lighter and the whole is heavier, well, it's just because it's not ground up, it's thicker. So you want to make sure that what the recipe says is what it whether it's the whole husk or if it's the powder, because you use less of the powder than you do of the husk. I think it's less. Am I saying it the right way? Yeah, I think that would be more surface area. And I do have a couple. I'm trying to think if I did. I think we did a class that had that, so we could add that to the mix. Okay, thank you. Anything else? All right, so can we go back to the slideshow? Thank you. All right, and the next slide. All right, so I want to spend a couple minutes on this pancake organizer. Can you move that computer a little closer to me so I can see it? Yeah, thank you. So what I want you to do is I just want you to look at this recipe for a moment. The recipe is in the handout that is included in the chat with some instructions. But I want to talk about, so let's say, you're looking at a recipe. You might need to use a different kind of milk. You might need to use an egg substitute. You're trying to take a regular recipe and convert it. It's really important to understand what each ingredient does in that particular recipe. So if can I omit it? Can I add more of it? What's happening? So let's just go through each. I mean, they should be very obvious, but the flour, right? So the flour is there to kind of hold everything together. Sometimes in pancake recipes, you don't always need to use gum, but I've started to do it. I find that it comes out better, but you don't want too much. So you want to use a gluten-free flour that either has gum or you're going to add gum to it. The baking powder in this recipe gives it the lift, and and if you notice there's a lot of baking powder, it makes it super fluffy. One of the things that that baking powder needs is both heat and usually some type of acid to help with that. So that comes in later. But baking soda is like a single acting and the baking powder is a double acting. So for fluffy pancakes, I like to use baking powder. Salt. Now you might say, well, why are you putting salt in a baking recipe? Because isn't salt more for savory things? Every single one of my baked goods has salt in it. It doesn't have a lot, but it has enough, because if not, it'll taste flat. I mean, of course, if you're on a low sodium diet, that's different. I'm just talking regular baked goods. Always, always add salt. If it tastes like you make it or it just doesn't taste, it has the flavor isn't quite there, you might have to increase the salt. Now, half a teaspoon is not very much. It's only about 2 grams, but I wouldn't usually don't put more than a teaspoon of salt in almost anything. And then the next ingredient is cinnamon, because our family likes cinnamon in pancakes. You don't have to put cinnamon in. You could put cardamom, you could put cloves, or you could put nothing. That is simply for flavor. We talked about all the different aspects. So that's what those 4 things do. The next bit are the eggs. Now, notice I wrote large eggs, because even large eggs can vary in how much they weigh, but if you're using, say, extra large eggs or using small eggs, you may need to either add more or less. And eggs do a couple things. They help to hold the recipe together, and they also help with the rising. So when you add, if you beat eggs and then you bake that, that's what gives it some of the lift. So that's an important part of a lot of the recipes that we bake with, that baked goods that we make. Next is buttermilk. So if you don't have buttermilk on hand, I haven't bought buttermilk in a long time, besides the fact that we're dairy free and I don't use regular milk for the most part. You can make your own buttermilk by adding some acid to the particular milk that you're using. So remember, I talked about chemistry. It's really important to know what are the acids. So I'm talking about vinegar, apple cider vinegar, lemon juice, anything that's going to be acidic that will help with the rise of the baked product. And sometimes you don't want to use it, but sometimes you do. And if you were to measure it, say you needed a cup and a half or a cup and a quarter, you would put in about a teaspoon or two, depending upon how much. I say if it was a cup, it would be about a teaspoon, maybe 2 teaspoons. You'd put the acid in first into the measuring cup, and then you'd fill the cup with the liquid, the milk, coconut milk, whatever it is, up to that 1 cup, and then leave it for a few minutes, and that gives you, buttermilk. I mean, it's close enough. I mean, you can always use buttermilk from the store. Sugar. So you don't need a lot of sugar in pancakes, but again, this is balance of flavor. And if you didn't add any sugar, it would taste like a crepe. It just tastes very. It wouldn't. It does add some flavor to the particular item. But in this situation, you could use coconut sugar. You could use maple syrup or maple sugar, and maybe some sugar substitutes. Vegetable oil melted butter. Why do you think that you wouldn't just add butter? Well, it's in the liquid. You kind of see how I wrote the recipe is the dry is on top and the liquid's on the bottom. It needs to be able to get mixed in. So in that um, in that example, you want something that's liquid at room temperature. So you don't want hot butter because you don't want it to cook the eggs, but something that's in a liquid form. And for me, I find I use a lot of avocado oil. I like that a lot. I think it works really well, but you can use any kind of vegetable oil. Maybe not olive because most of the olive oils impart a flavor in of itself. I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, you could use it, but depends if you like the flavor. But that will help with making it crisp and also for the texture. And then lastly, I usually add some vanilla. Guess what? Same thing like the cinnamon. You don't really have to put it in, but it does help with the flavor. But if you liked the flavor, maybe you wanted to make lemon pancakes, you could use a lemon extract. Where you wanted to use some kind of an orange flavor, then use a different kind of extract and in place of the vanilla. And then, as I said in the handout, I talk about how to make it. You would start with your dry ingredients. You have your wet ingredients in a separate, smaller bowl, mix together, add them together, stir it until there's pretty much no lumps. You want to make sure it's pourable. Make sure your griddle or pan is about medium or so, a little bit of grease in there, so nothing, oil or butter, so nothing sticks, and about a half a cup of batter per pancake. And then about 3 to 4 minutes, you see little bubbles on the top forming. That's when you turn it over, you keep cooking, and then it's pancakes. So I think this is a good recipe that would be good for doing some experimenting. So like, what would happen if I added a different if I did one with butter and one with oil, how would that taste? Well, let me make one with coconut milk and one with regular milk. Do I see a difference in the texture and the flavor, etc.? Okay, any questions about? Do you want to just check? Okay. All right, next is it's not my secret sauce, but a sauce recipe. And I will also tell you that when I first started cooking gluten-free, I didn't think you could use a gluten-free flour with butter to make a roux, because I just thought to myself, well, you don't have flour anymore, so you have to just make a cornstarch slurry. And then someone maybe, I don't know, 8 years ago said, no, I always make it with rice flour. And I was like, really? I didn't even think of that. So what I do now is I will use either rice flour like this, or my mix. Or on occasion, I have used the bobs. I just find that sometimes with the bobs making a roux, it just has a really sort of a floury taste that I don't particularly like. But before I was gluten-free and I was just in the culinary world, whenever we'd make a roux, the basic recipe was 2 tablespoons of fat, which is usually butter, 2 tablespoons of flour, and then 2 cups of whatever liquid we were using. So what I found was it works pretty closely doing the gluten-free flour. What can vary is if I only use rice flour, you see there has say 2 to 3 tablespoons. I found if I just use the rice, I needed 3 tablespoons, but if I use this blend, it was more like 2. And like I said, I prefer the blend without gum. And I've even made this very easily dairy free. You can just use a gluten free, margarine. And what I said, there was 2 cups of broth or milk, and you want that room temperature or warm. If you add cold milk or cold broth to a hot roux, it's going to take longer and it might separate a little bit. Always want to add a little salt, unless something you're making is the broth is already very salty, and any kind of seasoning. So when you're making, so if you were to make your gravy for Thanksgiving, you wanted to make a cream sauce or creamy sauce, maybe for a soup or for just maybe a biscuits and gravy. The 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 way to do it is a flour, gluten-free flour plus butter and a saute and a like a not a saute pan, maybe like a little pot, and you're going to whisk that and cook it for about 5 to 8 minutes. And you want it to get a little bit brown, but not burnt, but not too white because it needs to cook a little bit. And then once it's cooked and it sort of looks like a paste, you're adding some hot liquid, and then you still need to add usually some other flavoring. So for Thanksgiving, I usually use the chicken stock, but I'll add maybe some thyme or some poultry seasoning to give it more flavor. And when I talk about, this is a base recipe. It can be halved, it can be quartered, it can be quadrupled. And the way to make it your own is to use the flavors that you like and use the seasonings that you like. So maybe you want to add cayenne pepper. Absolutely. You can put anything you want and just see how it tastes. And maybe you want to use less salt, maybe you want to use more salt. This is what I use to make cheese sauces as well, except I will add at the end, I'll add some grated cheese and then turn the heat off and let it just sort of melt in. So I think that's it. Are there any questions about the sauces? Okay, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so what's next for me? Like, what am I doing? I have a lot of dishes, juggling a lot of things, but that's okay. So I'm really trying to make my content that's aimed at either home bakers and cooks, maybe cottage food bakers, and I'm also anywhere I can. I try to help food service establishments, either restaurants or cafes, but usually ones that are closer to where I am. I live in California near San Francisco. I am working on online content for baking so that if you can't make it to a class and you just want access to that, there are already a lot of recipes on amythefamilychef.com. That's my website under the blog. I've been blogging for now, what is it, like 16 years? Was it 2007? Yeah, long time. Ooh, I sound old. I teach online classes, so I'm trying to give my secrets, because if other people can do this, I'd much rather go to your bakery and buy your brioche rolls. I don't have to do it all the time. And then now I'm also trying to create content for college students. So that's what I'm going to work on next. I do have the next month for me is pretty busy, but I will try to create some workshops once I look at the feedback and figure out how to orchestrate that. So I have many of your emails, so you might see an email from me, and we'll go from there. So especially if you haven't, I probably want to send out the link to the recording and the link to the content, the class notes and so forth. And if you go to amythefamilychef.com, there's a place to enter your email for virtual classes, but I think I'm going to create one just for this group, because I feel like this is very, very targeted. And yeah, I mean, I feel like with all the experience I have, I honestly want to try to teach more people, because I feel like the more people that know, and especially the young people, please, you guys can just go, make bread and let me just buy it from you. It's hard. All right, any last questions? You want to just see if anything else is coming up? We're almost done. I can't believe I did this in an hour. That's pretty good for me. I think I was speaking that's why my mouth is dry, speaking fast. All right, so we go to the last slide. There's one last slide there. Thank you. All right, so in conclusion, we're almost done. Find a gluten-free flour that works for your needs, or a gluten-free blend that works for your needs, because it really depends on what you're doing. Again, I've told you what I like. The authentic foods, I think, is the best one out there. You can try making your own, or you can buy it. It's always good to have some gluten-free flours on hand. I think at a minimum, the rice, tapioca, and potato are good because you can make a blend anytime with that. And the oftentimes the rice is used for things like the breading and for thickening. And tapioca is good for if you're rolling things out and you want something that's very fine. The tapioca is actually, like, say you're rolling out sugar cookies or maybe like what else do I use? I use them for pot stickers. I make my own pot stickers, and I use the tapioca flour because it doesn't make it too dry. Um, I think that experimenting is really important. And I think when you go into if you make a recipe and it doesn't come out the way you want it, take that step back and evaluate it. Is it dry? Is it too wet? Is it not sweet enough? Doesn't have flavor? And then sort of maybe try it again, making some adjustments. And this is why using the scale is so important. So if you have a recipe and it calls for 2 cups, what you need to do is take that particular flour you're using and weigh out, see how much 2 cups weighs. And again, it's scoop half of it, put more flour on top, flatten it out, and then weigh that cup and see how much, because this weighs different to one cup of this weighs different to 1 cup of this. But 200 grams of this is 200. I would say that's when I taught a class, I'm like, 200 grams is those 200 grams, but you don't know if that's a cup or if that's a cup and a half. It's not going to vary that much, but that's the point. So experimenting is important, especially for my college kids out there. So, I know it's going to feel like chem lab, but that's the way to learn. And hopefully, with the recipes that are out there, especially the ones on my blog, I really learning technique is the best advice I can give you, not just learning recipes. I know TikTok, I'm going to sound so old now, but like TikTok and Instagram, everyone's got reels, but they're not really teaching how to cook. You have to understand how to cook. So hopefully you'll sign up for classes, or if there are any other questions. Anything else? I think the next step, maybe there's something. Oh, thank you. You're welcome to. I can just see, I can kind of see far away. I see, thank you. You're all welcome. It's my pleasure. And I'm going to think about sort of what I want to do next. And maybe what I'll do is send out a survey to see what people want to learn. And I have some content out there already. So I will work on sharing that with you. But did everyone hopefully get the handout and all the links? If you didn't, just put something in the chat. Alan can access those and put those back out. And I think we can go ahead and when we stop recording. So I'm going to stop recording and say thank you very much. We appreciate you being here, and hopefully I'll see you again.